Hello, wonderful people. Welcome to Cosmology Talks. Today we have Gerrit Farren, who is a PhD student at Cambridge University, and Alex Krolewski, who's a postdoc at Perimeter Institute and the Waterloo Centre of Astrophysics. Today they're talking about cross-correlations of the ACT, CMB lensing, and WISE Galaxies, with a little bit of Planck CMB lensing put in as well. This is very interesting to me because it gives information about a window of the S8 tension. You have the CMB at very high redshift, and you have some sort of local tension, but it's unclear whether that local tension kicks in at a medium redshift of 3 or 2, or only at very low redshifts, and it's also unclear whether it's present at large scales or only at small scales. We know from cosmic shear sort of stuff that there's something going on at the low redshift, small scales. And the ACT primary lensing tells us that at the kind of intermediate redshifts and large scales, there doesn't seem to be a tension. But what we're hearing about today is narrowing in on that bottom left quadrant, I guess, the low redshift and large scales, and whether there is or isn't tension, which I guess we'll be finding out in the next couple of moments. Yeah, so welcome, Gerrit and Alex. Do you want to start by telling us briefly about your paper?
Yeah, so in our paper, what we do is we cross-correlate galaxies from the unWISE Galaxy catalog, which is derived from the WISE satellite, which Alex will describe in a little more detail, with our new ACT DR6 lensing map, which covers about 9,400 square degrees, so about a quarter of the sky, and we get some really competitive constraints on the low redshift structure formation.
So unWISE is an ideal sample for CMB lensing cross correlations. It's derived from full sky WISE infrared imaging. And so it therefore covers a very large area of 30,000 square degrees, so basically entirely covers the ACT footprint. And because galaxies tend to be brighter in the infrared than the optical, it's really ideal for pushing out to higher redshift and therefore having good overlap with the CMB lensing kernel. And so we have a very large number of galaxies between redshift of about 0.5 and 2, which is where large-scale structure most efficiently lenses the cosmic microwave background.
Our headline results are essentially that we find very competitive constraints on S8 from ACT cross-correlated with unWISE, and then we also combine with a cross-correlation between Planck and unWISE, and we constrain S8 to about a bit over 2%. And these results are perfectly consistent with the predictions from the primary CMB, which is sort of in contrast to galaxy weak lensing surveys. So we can also combine with baryon acoustic oscillation, which breaks the degeneracy between the matter density and sigma 8, and then we can constrain sigma 8 on its own, and again we find constraints that are perfectly consistent with the predictions from the primary CMB derived from Planck.
Do you at any point do a combined constraint? Because looking at how not in tension these are, a combined constraint of Planck CMB anisotropies with your new ACT cross unWISE?
Yeah, so this is something we would talk about in future work. So that is something that we're planning, but it's not yet been done. We just focused on the cross-correlation measurement as first.
Awesome, thanks. If people are thinking of this talk or your paper 6 months or a year from now, and there are only 2 things that they're able to remember, what would you want those 2 things to be?
I think the first thing is the results. We find no evidence for any sort of S8 or sigma 8 tension on large scales and at redshifts above about 0.2. So putting that together with the CMB lensing autocorrelation results, essentially there's no evidence for a S8 tension from redshift 0.2 upwards. The second thing is that we really perform an exhaustive set of null and consistency tests, something which some other cross-correlation analyses haven't gone into as much detail. This is something that we're able to do because we have access to various variations of the ACT lensing map. We use variations of the galaxy selections and so on. And so we can really show that our results are robust to various different analysis choices.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's get into the background and the motivation now. I guess I mentioned the S8 tension earlier, but maybe you want to go into more detail. Maybe there are other motivations. What questions needed solved? Why is this relevant now in 2023 and not a few years ago or a few years from now?
The S8 tension has been around for several years now, where the amplitude of structure formation of the matter field seems to be a little bit lower in weak lensing surveys at low redshift than the primary CMB. And that's illustrated by this figure here. And just as a reminder of the notation here, S8 is a combination of the sort of base lambda CDM parameters, sigma 8 and omega matter. It's the combination that is sort of the best constrained parameter from weak lensing. And you can see the tension here between the blue and the green weak lensing results, preferring slightly lower S8 than the CMB anisotropies from both Planck and ACT plus WMAP.
What people have proposed is that could it be that the S8 tension is a scale-dependent effect? In particular, there was this proposal by Alex Amon, George Estafio, and Calvin Preston, who looked into whether there could be a suppression on nonlinear scales that explains why galaxy weak lensing surveys find lower S8 than is predicted from the primary CMB. Now, why do we want to use CMB lensing? Now, CMB lensing is independent of galaxy weak lensing, but it probes the same physics. The main difference is that particularly the autocorrelation is sensitive to quite higher redshift, so upwards of redshift of 1, while the weak lensing results will be below redshift of 1. The cross correlation, on the other hand, you are able to pick out a redshift slice that you're interested in. So in our case, we are mostly sensitive to the redshift range between 0.2 and 1.6, but still on relatively large scales, smaller than K of about 0.3 h megaparsec inverse. In the ACT autocorrelation analysis, which came out recently and was led by Frank Q, Matt Madhavacharil, and Neil McCrann, we found that the measurements for structure growth at redshift slightly greater than 1 and on large scales are consistent with predictions from the primary CMB. That motivates pushing now to lower redshifts, but at similar scales. In addition, this also helps improve your sensitivity to neutrino mass. By combining high redshift data from the primary CMB and low redshift data from CMB lensing, from galaxy weak lensing surveys, from CMB lensing cross correlations, we can constrain the neutrino mass by probing the evolution of structure between high redshifts and low redshifts. And here is a plot from the recent ACT DR6 lensing paper, where we see the constraints that were obtained there. And we expect that those can be improved once we add the cross-correlation data as well.
Awesome, thanks. Let's get into the details then. How do you actually do the cross-correlation? How do you make the WISE Galaxy catalogs? And then how does that impact upon the results?
Yeah, so our goal here is to measure fluctuations in the matter field, and this is what's going to be ultimately proportional to our cosmological parameters sigma 8, omega m, and therefore S8. If we just had the lensing map, that the fluctuations in the lensing map are coming from fluctuations in the matter density. However, as Gerrit mentioned earlier, CMB lensing is sensitive to a very wide range in redshifts. So if we want to isolate the fluctuations from a particular redshift, that is why we're also combining with the galaxy sample. The complication is that once we start considering the cross-correlation of the galaxies and the CMB lensing, this amplitude of the power spectrum is now sensitive to both the galaxy bias and the underlying matter density fluctuations. And the galaxy bias is just coming from the fact that galaxies inhabit peaks in the matter field, which are more clustered than the matter field as a whole. And it is an astrophysical nuisance parameter. We break the degeneracy between galaxy bias and matter fluctuations by considering both the CMB lensing cross-correlation and the galaxy autocorrelation. These are sensitive to different powers of the galaxy bias. The autocorrelation has 2 powers of bias, whereas the cross-correlation has 1. So kind of heuristically, we can consider our cosmological parameters as the ratio of the square of the cross-correlation divided by the autocorrelation, as shown in the middle plot. Now, in fact, we forward model both the autocorrelation and the cross-correlation, so we're never taking ratios of noisy data, but this is sort of a heuristic picture for what we're doing. This is the plot showing those angular power spectra. The galaxy autocorrelation is on the top. The CMB lensing cross-correlation is on the bottom. These are angular spectra, and so therefore we've labeled them as CLs. So it's power as a function of angular multipoles. So large scales are on the left and small scales are on the right.
And is it okay to just have blue as low redshift galaxies, green as high redshift galaxies? Is there anything else that might be interesting about them, at least in the way they were selected or anything? Or
they're selected in similar ways. I'll show the selection cut in just a couple of slides. At some level, you can think of having the two samples as having a consistency check of the results from one or the other, a relatively basic consistency check in that they're selected from the same underlying data, but it's still, better to assess consistency than not. So here we're also showing the scales that we use. So the scales that are omitted are given in gray. So we're omitting small scales because they're harder to model. So that's the exclusion over on the right. And we are omitting large scales because they are more sensitive to observational systematics. That is the exclusion over on the left. The signal to noise of the CMB lensing cross correlation for the entire scale range is 67 for the blue sample and 74 for the green sample. After applying the scale cuts, it's 40 for the blue sample and 51 for the green sample. And the signal to noise of the cross correlation is essentially what's going to set the cosmological sensitivity of our results. This is because the autocorrelation is measured at much higher statistical significance because we have very large and dense galaxy samples. So therefore, thinking of this measurement heuristically as a ratio of cross-correlation to autocorrelation, the sensitivity on that ratio is dominated by the error bar on the cross-correlation.
These small scales presumably are still very interesting. Is there work in the future to try and extend the region that is done with the cosmological analysis, or is this something that's just too messy to even dream of modeling?
So it's definitely challenging to push to smaller scales here. There is some attempts to do so using, for example, these novel hybrid effective field theory approaches. This is something that we will explore in the future. There has also been work on using these cross correlations to constrain HOD models. And so for those small scales are very informative. But generally, they haven't constrained HOD and cosmology jointly, at least so far.
Can I ask a really dumb question? When the kind of cosmic shear galaxy weak lensing people give talks, they're doing their cross correlations with EBOS. You guys are cross correlating with unWISE. What is it about the two different lensing data sets that make EBOS relevant for one and unWISE relevant for the other?
So unWISE is somewhat better suited for the CMB lensing cross correlations because it's at higher redshift and has higher density than BOS and EBOS. EBOS and BOS are spectroscopic samples. For this sort of a cross correlation, we're always measuring angular statistics. So we don't need spectra for every galaxy, and we can get a larger sample by having a photometric sample rather than a spectroscopic sample. The other advantage of unWISE is the sky coverage is very large. So we have 30,000 square degrees, basically the entire sky outside of the galactic plane. And this really takes advantage of the fact that the CMB lensing maps are also cover a large fraction of the sky. So this is larger than DES, which is 5,000 square degrees, KIDS, which is 1,500, or HSC, which is 1,000 square degrees. The WISE satellite has been conducting two-band infrared imaging for about the last, I forget if it's 9 or 10 years, but there's quite a bit of data. And it turns out that you can simply and quite effectively select a large number of galaxies from this two-band infrared imaging. So we use the unWISE catalog, which is sort of a processing of the WISE data, and we select galaxies with a simple color cut between the two WISE bands. These are at 3.4 and 4.6 microns. These bands that are further into the infrared than typical galaxy selections, which are optical or near infrared, really enable us to select more higher redshift galaxies and take advantage of the better overlap of high redshift with the CMB lensing kernel. We define 3 WISE galaxy samples. This is given in the plot over on the left, where we have matched unWISE galaxies to a small number of very good photometric redshifts in the cosmos field. This is in about 1 square degree. The different samples are just different color cuts made between these two WISE bands. And they've been named blue, green, and red in sort of order of increasing redshift and increasing redness in these two WISE bands. In this work, we're only considering the blue and the green sample. The red sample is considerably lower number density, and it has it's somewhat more difficult to model, given that it sort of didn't improve the statistics very much and brought in some more systematic errors. We didn't consider it.
And this blue, green, red distinction, it's completely arbitrary where you put these two black lines that are like separating blue and green, or is there some reason why it's there and not a little to the left or a little to the right?
It's fairly arbitrary. I mean, we wanted to have samples that had a relatively high number density and that were distinct in Redshift. The Redshift distribution of each of these samples is sort of broad enough that it would be not very meaningful to make more than 3 samples. Yeah, so as part of defining the WISE sample, and so this is some stuff that we've done in past work. So we've defined a mask around bright stars, around the Milky Way, nearby galaxies, all sorts of various imaging things that can cause artifacts in the maps that are not truly extragalactic. Another important step is to make sure that we remove stars from our sample. Since we're selecting sources from the WISE imaging, since it has quite a large PSF compared to optical imaging, we need to make sure that we can remove stars. So at the resolution of WISE, a star and a redshift half galaxy both look like point sources. So we need some external set of data to do this. It turns out that Gaia is actually quite well matched to these WISE galaxies in terms of depth. And so if we go into Gaia and we say we match our WISE sources to anything in Gaia, and we remove something that Gaia thinks is a star based on its very high resolution photometry, we can remove most of the stars and get down to about 2% stellar contamination. And then finally, these first couple papers performed a variety of systematics tests, which we sort of used as a baseline for the systematics tests in the current paper and have extended greatly.
You said PSF at one point, which I guess is point spread function, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea that if there was a true point source, the telescope would see it as a diffuse bit of light, and that's kind of defining how the telescope blurs stuff out. And as you were saying, a galaxy and a star would both appear the same because the point spread function is big enough that you can't measure the galaxy's intrinsic width.
Yes, that's right. And the fact that WISE has such a large PSF is coming from the fact that it's actually a very small telescope. This is, in optical imaging, or people are used to thinking of the PSF as mostly coming from the atmosphere, and then you go to space and you have a very small PSF. WISE, we go to space, but we have a 40-centimeter telescope, so the PSF is still large.
Okay, and maybe another dumb observation, but you use Gaia to remove the stars. Someone might be wondering why not use Gaia instead of WISE, but Gaia, if I'm correct, has mostly just measured stuff within the Milky Way. So it's very good at identifying stars, but doesn't see distant galaxies. Is that also correct?
Yes, that is correct. We could add that there is some recent work selecting quasars from Gaia and using them for a cosmological analysis. And this is also very interesting, and it's sort of, in some sense, complementary because I think they start with Gaia and then they use WISE to remove some contaminating sources. So we previously cross-correlated unWISE galaxies with the 2018 Planck CMB lensing map, and we actually had also found a low value of S8, very similar to the weak lensing surveys. So we got S8 about 2 sigma below the Planck primary CMB.
Given that you kind of showed your results at the beginning, we already know that the ACT cross unWISE isn't in tension with Planck primary CMB. So why was Planck cross unWISE in a bit of tension? And is this somehow saying that ACT and Planck lensing are in some obscure way in tension? Or is this all stuff you want to talk about later?
So essentially, we'll go into a reanalysis of Planck cross unWISE.
So unWISE galaxies are selected from 2-band infrared imaging. And this means that defining photometric redshifts in a similar way to the weak lensing surveys is impossible. The sort of redshift sensitivity you have is some very broad kernel of width delta z of 0.5. It's just basically never going to get a photometric redshift. And so we instead use quite a different technique to measure the redshift distribution. So we use this clustering redshift technique that has been actually around for a while, but has been developed quite a bit over the past few years. And the idea here is that if you have a sample with an unknown redshift distribution, and you cross-correlate it with a precisely localized spectroscopic galaxy sample, the amplitude of that cross-correlation is proportional to the redshift distribution of the unknown sample. And so basically what you do is you take that spectroscopic sample in a number of very narrow redshift bins, and then you measure the amplitude of the cross-correlation in each of those bins, and that builds up the sort of binned redshift distribution of the photometric sample. You're also sensitive to the galaxy biases of the photometric and spectroscopic samples. The spectroscopic galaxy bias can be measured from the galaxy autocorrelation. The photometric galaxy bias is sort of impossible to disentangle. But for this analysis, that's actually kind of a feature rather than a bug, because when we have to model the angular auto and cross correlations, we always need to consider the galaxy bias together with the galaxy redshift distribution. So the equations at the bottom of this slide here are showing how you project from the 3D matter power spectrums, that's the P of K, to the angular power spectra that we measure. In this work, we've improved the redshift distribution measurement over what we had done in the past cross correlations with Planck. We've added a couple more spectroscopic samples to cross-correlate with. We need a number of spectroscopic samples across the redshift range, and these are basically coming from the BOSS and eBOSS surveys. Since those last papers, there's been another data release of eBOSS, and so we are now using their LRGs, which are constraining the redshift distribution between redshift 0.6 and 1, which is quite important for our unWISE Galaxy samples in that range. And we've also updated the eBOSS quasars that we were using. And again, those are essentially covering most of our redshift, or the sort of the higher part of our redshift range. This is another good way of reducing the measurement uncertainty on the redshift distribution. Finally, we're also adding spectroscopic data in the South Galactic Cap, which is a relatively small fraction of the BOSS and eBOSS area, but it provides better overlap with the ACT footprint. So the figure down here is showing our binned redshift measurements going from the old DNDZ in our papers from a few years ago, and then adding the eBOSS LRG sample, the SGC samples, and then finally adding weights for the WISE galaxies, which I will describe in the next slide. We want to measure the fluctuations in the matter density. When we measure galaxy fluctuations, in addition to the complications of galaxy bias, there's also the complication that the galaxy fluctuations may depend on some imaging systematics instead of the real cosmological fluctuations. And so we found that the WISE galaxy density depends also on the density of stars in the Milky Way and on the depth of coverage of WISE. So what we did is we fit these trends with a linear regression model, and we defined a set of imaging weights to mitigate them. And so these sets of plots are showing both the blue and the green sample. Sort of the raw data on the left has this pretty strong trend. The corrected data on the right has removed most of the fluctuations to within a few percent. This has had a relatively modest impact on our auto and cross spectra, leading to changes of about 0.5%. Now I have to unpack that a little bit because that's not what you see on this figure. So this figure is a little bit complicated. So the solid lines are representing our current measurements. The dashed lines are representing our older measurements from a few years ago. And in those measurements, we had mitigated some of these extra fluctuations by basically applying a higher pass filter to the WISE sample. Both of them are being compared to what would happen if we didn't do any correction, which would lead to about a 3% higher amplitude in the autocorrelation on the top.
I think I see now why you have this low L cut if the high pass filter and new, more sophisticated analysis are so different at, say, L of 50 in the top plot, then I guess, you might be worrying about what's going on. Do you have any idea what's causing that?
Yeah, that's right. So all of these galactic systematics have a more steeply falling power spectrum than galaxies. And therefore, at low L, they will always tend to dominate. But at high L, they'll be suppressed. And this is kind of a generic feature of galaxy autospectrum measurements. And in fact, we've done other sorts of systematics tests, like looking at how the spectra vary with ecliptic latitude and galactic latitude. And those tests have also shown that this L less than 100 is more affected by these kinds of systematics. Another thing to point out is that you'll notice that the gray band is a little bit, it goes to L of 100 in the autocorrelation, and it goes to L of 50 in the cross correlation. And that's because the autocorrelation is more sensitive to these systematics than the cross correlation.
I guess you do see this drop off in the blue high pass filter, even within the band that you're allowing. But I guess so long as you trust that your more sophisticated analysis is the correct one, then you don't need to worry about that.
Yeah, well, that's a drop from the L of 75 point that we use to the L of 25 point that we don't use.
So at 75, it's still relatively aligned. Mm-hmm. So there's no L equals 50 point. It's just 25 and 75.
Yeah, that's right. The first point, the little intersection that you see is the first point. Indeed, yeah, that's, it's a bit scary to have that, and it's nice that that is not as strong a drop in the updated analysis.
So in addition to the changes we've made on the Galaxy data side, we've also made a series of changes to the modeling. The first one is a new method of marginalizing over uncertainties in the redshift distribution. So as Alex mentioned, we measure these redshift distributions by cross-correlating with spectroscopic galaxies. But obviously there's some sample variance and some uncertainty in that measurement. In order to propagate that forward to our results, we use a method that's based on principal component analysis. So essentially what happens is you have a bunch of data points in Redshift that give you B, D, and DZ. We fit a smooth spline through those points with a positivity constraint. Now we generate noise realizations of these data points according to the noise covariance that we obtain from the clustering Redshift measurements. And then we perform a principal component analysis on those noise realizations. And we add as many principal components to our analysis as are required to cover 90% of the variance in these noise realizations. So the effective Redshift kernel that we then use in our analysis is given at the bottom here, which is the best fit plus some mean offset between the best fit and the realizations, and then a sum of principal components where each of the coefficients is marginalized over. Now, those coefficients are not left completely free. They are informed by the priors that are derived by transforming the noise realizations into the basis of principal components and then measuring the distribution of PCA coefficients. And so this is the redshift distribution that we then end up using in our analysis. Now, the next modeling improvement that we make is on the power spectrum side. So as in Alex's previous analysis, we use a hybrid halo fit plus Lagrangian perturbation theory model. This approach is inspired by what happens in these hybrid effective field theory models. Essentially, you have a lowest order contribution to the theory, which arises from simulation, where you've simulated the nonlinear dark matter clustering, but you've expanded systematically the relationship between galaxies and dark matter distribution. That's why we have at lowest order the matter power spectrum, in which here we use the HM code matter power spectrum, which is scaled by a galaxy bias, and then we add to it additional contributions from Lagrangian perturbation theory. And we do that consistently for the galaxy auto spectrum and the cross spectrum between galaxy and matter, which is relevant for the cross correlation between galaxies and matter. What's new in our work is that in order to determine the evolution of the higher order biases, we add a free parameter. So previously, those higher order biases were set and completely fixed by a co-evolution relation that's measured from n-body simulations. So essentially, you measure the higher order bias as a function of the lowest order bias. But in our analysis, we now add an additional free parameter that is an offset to this co-evolution. And we find that having just a single free parameter that parameterizes the offset is sufficient to capture a wide variety of bias evolutions, because we end up integrating over Redshift anyway. And so lots of the variation you could see with Redshift can actually be absorbed into a single effective amplitude. Now, the other thing that is new about our analysis is a vastly expanded range of null and consistency tests. So because we have access to a wide range of variational analysis on the ACT lensing side, we can perform null tests such as shown here on the left side, the comparison between the cross-correlation using only ACT data at 150 and only at 90 gigahertz. So this is a test that's sensitive, for example, to extragalactic contamination of the lensing data, arising, for example, from CIB contamination or from TSC contamination. We also do other tests like comparing the temperature-only reconstruction from ACT with a polarization-only reconstruction or a reconstruction based on the optimal combination of temperature and polarization data, which is our baseline. Then we also do a number of null tests on the galaxy side using different masks. So I've shown here a comparison of two galactic masks. So one that uses the 60% of the sky with the lowest dust contamination, and then one comparing to analysis that uses only 40% with the lowest dust contamination. But we also did tests using only the northern or southern galactic cap and comparing our baseline footprint with a footprint that's restricted to high ecliptic latitudes, where the unWISE depth is higher and there's less concerns about contamination like zodiacal light. In addition to those null tests, we also have a series of simulation-driven tests. So what we did here is we took realistic foreground simulations from the web sky simulations. We populated the web sky halo catalog with unWISE light galaxies using an HRD model. And then we cross-correlated a lensing reconstruction performed only on the foreground maps with those galaxy samples. And so essentially what this simulates is, what if those foregrounds were present in the lensing data? What would the bias to your spectrum be? And you can see that with our baseline analysis, which uses geometric methods for hardening against contamination from TSC clusters, we get a basically negligible bias. However, if you do no mitigation, then you get a very significant bias, which would change our results quite significantly. The final set of tests is a set of consistency tests at the parameter level. So here we are showing the parameter S8 cross, which is sort of the best constrained parameter in our analysis. It's very closely related to the standard S8. We can see that all the variational analysis we've performed are consistent across both the combination of blue and green, the individual samples blue and green, using a wide variety of different variational analyses. We find completely consistent results. So I showed these results in the beginning, but let's dive into a little more detail on our cosmology constraints. So what you can see here are the posterior distributions on the cosmological parameters that we constrain in our analysis. So that's omega matter and sigma 8, in particular S8, and then this parameter S8 cross that I already hinted at, which is the best constrained parameter in our analysis. And it's defined similar to S8, but instead of the exponent being 0.5, we use 0.45. Which we find to be the best constraint parameter simply empirically by looking at the degeneracy directions in our data.
If I was someone who saw tensions everywhere, the DR6 blue and DR6 green datasets are suspicious. If I was someone who sees no tensions anywhere, I'd be like, it's just one sigma. What is this other person worrying about? But is there something there that is worth thinking about?
Yes, so there's various aspects, and we go into great detail about this in our paper. But essentially, these two samples are consistent at the 1.7 sigma level. So it is within what is expected sort of due to random fluctuations. The problem with this analysis is that when you're using only a single redshift sample, the parameters sigma 8 and omega matter are highly degenerate, as you can see in the posterior distribution here. And so it's very easy to be pushed along this degeneracy direction by even small fluctuations. And so that's why you see such a strong effect here. It's also the case that this particular tension is very sensitive to the higher order biases in our model, which are a priori unknown. Once we combine the two data sets, there's actually enough information to constrain those parameters beyond the information given by priors. But in the individual analysis for the two redshift samples, those are quite prior dominated. That's why these are sort of driven apart. So I mentioned already that we can combine with additional data to break the degeneracy between omega matter and sigma 8. In this case, we use BAO data. Constraints from BAO mostly lie in the omega matter H0 plane. And so that helps to break the degeneracy that we see in our data. And now we can constrain sigma 8 on its own. And we find sigma 8 equals 0.813 plus or minus 0.020, perfectly consistent again with the predictions from the primary CMB from Planck. Now in this plot, you can also see that this hint at a tension between the blue and green sample has gone away once you've added additional data, because now you're able to constrain these higher order bias parameters, and all those fluctuations that drove you in a particular direction are gone.
Yeah, so I guess that's just saying that on this previous slide that the place where the BAO overlapped was where the green and blue were already overlapping, I guess.
That's correct, yes. Now, obviously, we've said we've made all these improvements on the Galaxy side, on the modeling side. So it's obvious that we were going to reanalyze the Planck data with the same model and with the improved Galaxy data set. In the process, we noticed another aspect of the analysis that we ended up correcting. So in CMB lensing reconstruction, there's a well-known effect related to a misnormalization of the lensing reconstruction. And that's generally corrected in CMB lensing autocorrelation analyses by applying a Monte Carlo norm correction. You run lensing reconstruction on realistic simulations, and you estimate the fractional misnormalization. And then the data is corrected for that effect. In pretty much any CMB lensing cross-correlation analysis to date, this effect had been neglected. But as you can see here, for Planck, this effect is about 2%, which is comparable to the error bars in the unWISE analysis. So this is a significant effect that needs to be accounted for. And we did this in addition to all the improvements that we've made on the modeling and Galaxy side. Beyond just using the new Galaxy data and making this fix for the MC norm correction, we also switched to the newest available Planck lensing reconstruction. So that's the Planck lensing reconstruction PR4, which is derived from the N-pipe maps, which use a slightly larger sky area and a more optimal way of reconstructing the lensing. And so we obtain higher signal to noise, improving the measurement over previous results. Here we have just summarized the effect of various changes that we've made. So this MC norm correction that I just mentioned is about a 0.6 sigma effect on the overall results, considering the parameter S8. The modeling improvements we made actually push S8 further down. So had we just made those changes, we would have obtained even higher tension with Planck than previously. The other changes, the systematics weights, the additional spectroscopic data, switching to PR4 lensing reconstruction and implementing our PCA DNDZ marginalization, have impacts at the 0.4, 0.8 sigma level as well. And so at the end of the day, we come out about 1.3 sigma higher than the previous analysis, and with slightly wider posteriors as well, because our PCA DNDZ marginalization is more conservative than the previous approach taken. So all these changes together now move the S8 value obtained from the cross-correlation between Planck and unWISE up to 0.805 plus or minus 0.018, also consistent within expectations with the primary CMB. And so also consistent with the results we found from ACT.
I have a habit of doing what I'm about to do and always being told it's just higher dimensional stuff, but it kind of confuses me that if I just say look at the one-dimensional posteriors here, or even the two-dimensional ones, that the combined green and blue ones lie more or less on top of the green one and not halfway between the green and the blue. Why is the green so much more constraining? I appreciate it's slightly narrower, but still, I'm pretty sure if you just had the 1D data, that the combined constraint would not be so close to the green one. Or is this just me trying to do statistics on 1D contour plots by eye, when in fact that's just a silly thing to do?
Yeah, stats by eye are indeed somewhat dangerous. Even if you look at the 2D plots here, you probably don't get the full picture. So as I mentioned, there's these higher order bias parameters, which are very degenerate with sigma 8 and omega matter when considering only a single parameter, a single Galaxy redshift sample. Essentially, what's happening here is that by combining the data, the higher order bias parameters for the blue sample get pushed along a degeneracy that then allow it to be basically consistent with the green sample. The chi-squared for this joint fit is very reasonable. We get a PTE of about 0.5.
PTE being probability to exceed, meaning if you get a very small value of that, then your probability of this data given the model is very small, but 0.5 is about as good as it gets, almost suspiciously good. But
exactly, yes. Yeah, and so then obviously we did the same thing we did on the ACT analysis, which is to combine with BAL and unsurprisingly find very similar results. And so given the consistency here, obviously we did combine the Planck and ACT results. And you can see here how that improves our constraints. So in orange, we can see the results from ACT. In purple, the results from Planck. And then the combination is in black. And we find S8 0.81 plus or minus 0.015, which is sort of the headline result that we present in our paper. And then with BAO, again, we have a 0.813 plus or minus 0.015 constraint on sigma 8. And so those are basically completely on top of what the primary CMB predicts.
Is the dashed plot on the left-hand plot, that is the with BAO?
Yes, the dash curve on the left-hand side is an indication of how BAO shrinks those contours. So it's the same as the black contour on the right-hand side.
Cool. And the primary CMB isn't actually on this plot?
It's not on this plot. Here we compare with a variety of other data sets, and I recognize this plot is somewhat busy. But if we just look at the left-hand side for the moment, so here we've not added any external data to our analysis or to actually any of the Galaxy Week lensing surveys. So what you see here is our results again in yellow and in black. Then the primary CMB in this magenta contour. And you can see those are consistent. In particular, they're consistent within the smaller contour that's given by adding BAO data. And they're also very consistent with the results from CMB lensing using ACT data and Planck PR4 data. So that's the green contour. You can very clearly see that they are very different degeneracies, but they overlap where the primary CMB predicts the omega matter sigma 8 contour. Now the Galaxy Week lensing results are shown here as blue contours. So we have DES in light blue, HSC in some turquoise, and kids in navy. So on the left-hand side, we did not include kids because kids uses three-dimensional clustering, which implicitly already contains the BAO information. And so it's not comparable to those other two results that we show here. But you can see that while the DES results are sort of marginally consistent, they do predict a lower value of S8 and sigma 8 in this case. The same is true for HSC. And then when we move to the right-hand side, we've added BAO data consistently to all data sets. And you can see that the CMB lensing measurement, the prediction from the primary CMB, and our results are perfectly consistent, while the weak lensing surveys predict slightly lower values of sigma 8. And then we've also shown here an analysis of the cross-correlation between the DESI LRG samples with Planck lensing. This is work done by Martin White. And they also found a slightly smaller value of sigma 8 and DES8. Now, why that is still somewhat up for debate. So this, the Monte Carlo norm correction that I mentioned is also relevant to this analysis. However, some preliminary work has shown that it may not be sufficient to completely alleviate this tension. It might be a small effect, but it probably won't be enough to push it all the way up to be consistent with the primary CMB. But the team around this analysis is actively working on different aspects. It's possible that those results will change to some extent as well.
Have I just fallen asleep and not noticed that DESI have released data? Or otherwise, how does one get one's hands on DESI LRGs?
No, this is based on the DESI targeting data. So it's the DESI LRG targets that are being cross-correlated with here. However, the Redshift distributions that are used are calibrated using internal DESI data.
But yeah, so the redshift and scale dependence of that DESI LRG cross Planck should be roughly similar to your own analysis rather than similar to the cosmic shear kind of measurements. Is that?
That's correct. It's potentially slightly lower redshift, but comparable. I think Alex would be more of an expert on that.
Yes, that's right. It's very, very similar scales.
Cool. Yeah, that's really exciting. I mean, especially that DESI thing at the end. But prior to showing that plot, you certainly made a good case that any earlier Planck lensing cross-correlation tension has kind of been understood. And therefore, if S8 is a real thing, it's happening at small scales, low redshifts, or at least small scales. But what else is there that we should be thinking about in the future other than data from DESI?
Yeah, we're very excited about the future. Oh, I mean, data from DESI is a big reason why we're excited about the future. But we could break this down into a few different areas. So excited about continuing to improve this analysis with the unWISE Galaxies. One significant area of uncertainty is this uncertainty on the redshift distribution that Gerrit was talking about with the PCA marginalization that is sort of fundamentally coming from the statistical limits of the clustering redshift method. And we have already obtained a few redshifts from DESI, basically targeted redshifts of a small number of unWISE galaxies that can allow us to get a spectroscopic calibration of the redshift distribution and potentially help reduce the uncertainty on the redshifts. We're also very excited about combining our unWISE ACT cross-correlation with Planck primary CMB. As we discussed earlier, they are in very good agreement, so therefore they can be combined. And as Gerrit mentioned at the beginning, this combination is sensitive to the neutrino mass. So we're very excited about the potentials of that kind of an analysis. And finally, as we've discussed in a few places, our scale cuts are removing quite a bit of signal to noise on small scales. Therefore, we're excited about continuing to improve the modeling to try to recover some of this small scale information. And this is a big topic in cosmology, and I think it's not, I wouldn't say that we can necessarily get all the cosmological information from that signal to noise because some of it will go into the nuisance parameters, but it's quite possible that we can do better than what we've done and sort of try to add the small scales as an independent probe of the matter distribution. I think another big lesson of this kind of work is that new data and different data sets are critical from a systematics perspective as well as a statistics perspective. And that sort of gets at this comparison of our results to the DESI results. And so that is one way that we're quite excited about different data sets like galaxies from DESI sort of now and from Vera Rubin Observatory in the next few years. With DESI, we can already do a lot with the targeting for the LRGs. Of course, most of DESI's redshifts are emission line galaxies that are at higher redshifts than LRGs. Those are very hard to analyze with just the targeting data because a significant number of the redshifts fail. So there, having the spectroscopic data will be critical to gaining, sort of being able to perform an independent, also very high signals noise analysis. And of course, I shouldn't undersell the statistical improvements that will come from these experiments as well, and particularly from the better lensing measurements from Simon's Observatory, which is going to be starting next year.
You could have just quoted your S8 constraint for the blue and the green galaxy separately and used that as a kind of Z-dependent S8 measurement. Is that something that will be a future thing, that when people like yourselves are giving talks, you're going to have S8 as a function of these two parameters, K and Z, and we can really see where there isn't tension? And was there at all a redshift dependence? Or I guess once you combined with BAO, they looked like they were giving more or less the same value anyway. But is a Z-dependent S8 something we can look forward to?
Yes, when we're just looking at S8, the blue and the green sample are perfectly consistent. Now, we talked about sigma 8 and omega matter. As you mentioned, that goes away once you add BAO. There is no hint at any evolution here. The problem with the unWISE samples is, as we saw earlier in the redshift distributions, they are not very disjoint, so they have some significant overlap. So this analysis is not optimal to do what you're describing, but it's definitely something that's very interesting to look into, particularly with better sort of constrained samples like the DESI analysis or cross correlations with DES, where you have more sort of separate redshift bins.
I guess you could cross-correlate with DES, but not use the cosmic shear data? Because otherwise you're cross-correlating with the people who have already seen the tension. But
Um, that's also interesting. That isn't as helpful for sort of getting a sigma 8 of z, but yes, can also be done, and there is work in ACT on this topic as well. There is work on the cross-correlation with DES galaxy clustering that came out recently.
you mentioned neutrino mass in the intro a bit, but then there was no, therefore the consequences are this for neutrino mass. Is it something that still needs more data, or can you already say something about neutrino masses just with this new cross correlation?
The analysis of sort of extended models like massive neutrinos, like curvature, like modified gravity, we have sort of relegated to a follow-up paper that will deal with this analysis in the context of extended models, but also with, as Alex mentioned, combining with the primary CMB, which is what you need to do neutrino masses, and with the lensing autocorrelation analysis from ACT. So we will essentially do a 3x2 point analysis, and then additionally the primary CMB.
Okay, cool, thanks. So last question, what work being done in cosmology at the moment do you think is particularly interesting but underappreciated by the rest of the community?
One thing that I don't know whether it's underappreciated, but I think it's definitely very interesting, is work on calibrating sort of small scale uncertainties in the large scale structure modeling using KSC observations. Those are very sensitive to the baryon physics on small scales, and potentially can be folded into these weak lensing analyses and analyses like ours to inform the small scale uncertainties that arise from baryon physics. So I think that's something that's very interesting, and future observations with SO, for example, should be highly competitive.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for watching. If you like this, please do subscribe and click the bell if you want to be notified of new videos. Click like to help with YouTube algorithms, both for you and the channel, because YouTube will know to recommend more stuff like this. And share the channel with colleagues. If you have any questions or suggestions, leave a comment. Otherwise, you should check out the talk from a few months ago by Gerrit and Alex's colleagues on the actual CMB lensing autocorrelation measurements, which should be on the screen at the moment somewhere. And thanks, Gerrit and Alex, for the great talk.
Thank you.
Thanks.